Before starting, our 1700 and 1700X reviews will be delayed about a day or so because we are posting this video instead. I've been answering the same question pretty much all day, and it was already answered in our article. Now, to be fair, the article and the video viewers are generally slightly different audiences. The article is 11,000 words. To put that in perspective, in Microsoft Word, that's about 30 pages. So it's a big document, and there was a lot of research that went into the Ryzen review, including research on architecture defined on page 1, launch logistical challenges and memory support defined on page 2, testing methodology on page 3, several results for thermals, page 4, and it goes on. It's 8 pages on the site, split between 11,000 words. Big document, and that answers a lot of the questions. Now, unfortunately, a lot of folks are not seeing those relevant pages pertaining to testing methodology and memory support and things like that, and they're asking the same question over and over. So I wanted to put out a video that addresses that directly in another format that is hopefully more useful for the folks who did not go through the article. This is primarily addressing something I already did, which is differences in performance between one review to another. There are two primary reasons for this. Testing methodology, which is actually for once a lesser reason, and then the launch support for various products in the Stack and Ryzen ecosystem. So in that review, I spend a good deal of time talking about those two things because we knew leading into it that there are going to be a lot of questions on this launch because we spoke to all the reviewers for the most part that we know, spoke to all the manufacturers, that includes Asus, Corsair, AMD of course for a full week, and then several reviewers whom you are likely familiar with, particularly in the YouTube space, but a couple in the article space as well. Because as a reminder, we've been to San Francisco twice in the last week, last 10 days or so, and that's a good amount of time to talk to people. So the point of saying that is, in talking to all of these people, you learn, one, sanity checks and validation, and two, everyone's seen some disparate performance, and hence a large amount of space was dedicated to explaining why that happens, because it would definitely be a question. We also spoke to AMD about this for about an hour on the phone last night prior to embargo lift, and I spoke about some of that conversation with Joker, but we'll have some of the recording in this video today. So what I've done here is I've laid out a stack of paper for each of the concerns so that I can mentally organize everything, because again, giving you timelines. We were at the AMD event on the 22nd, I think, flew home the next day and started working on Ryzen. About 4 or 5 days later, left for another event to San Francisco. I had one person covering Vega remotely, and then I covered the 1080 Ti on site. Came home the next day and finalized the review, which the next day was Wednesday, the day before embargo lift. So it's basically been, it was about a 24-hour day finalizing the review. I was up about 24 hours, including the travel home. So we took it very seriously, getting everything done, providing the depth required to walk through every single possible thing we could include. Now, of course, you can't include every benchmark, but we did a good job considering the time constraints and put a lot of effort into validating things and sanity checking with others. So the results, 100%. We stand by all of the results, everything that was stated in the review. There are no changes whatsoever to the statements made in our 1800X review. That said, I want to walk through a few of the questions that we've gotten and other reviewers have gotten today. The first main one, why are there differences sometimes that are 20% in results from one review to the next? The first answer to that, motherboards that were provided to reviewers were provided at random. AMD did not, to my knowledge, go through and select which motherboard goes to which reviewer. This is important to note because the motherboard manufacturers I have spoken with have indicated to me that they did not receive a list of who got which motherboard. This is important because the BIOS and EFI versions that shipped with the motherboards were potentially different from what was actually production ready. This means that because, as we learned from AMD, motherboard vendors had about 3 weeks to get ready for this launch, some of those boards, which were not validated yet by AMD with the newest EFI, may have had an older EFI version shipped to reviewers and left that version on there if the reviewers did not seek out the motherboard vendor to get the updated version if there was one. For us, I emailed Asus the day I got the board and said, what do I need to know about this board? They sent over version 5704. That's the newest one. I believe the version that was on their default was 5702. To the best of my knowledge, there's a good chance that actually I know 100% because AMD told me, and we have a recording of it. There were versions of other BIOS, other motherboards like the MSI board, where there were some substantial differences in EFI from the launched reviewer sample version to the latest update that had the correct settings in there for AMD's retail version microcode. So the microcode before this, which may have been what some of the EFI versions were built for, did not necessarily have everything ready, which means that there will be differences in performance. Again, we tested 5704, that's the latest, that is the one that performed the best, so our results don't change. For people who used an ASUS Crosshair board with the 5702 BIOS, it is possible, though I have not independently verified, that they saw changes. I can tell you that with the, well actually we'll just play an audio clip right now from my call with AMD, where they were talking about the EFI versions being troublesome. They claimed it was the most troublesome on ASUS. They said that MSI was fine, something about fish, I don't know, and going to water or whatever. Basically, they were saying that MSI and Gigabyte reviewers with those boards, which I, at the time, had only just received, saw much better results than we were seeing. I noted to them that in speaking with other reviewers, that is not accurate to what I've been told from those other reviewers. So after calling them out on that, we got a further statement, which we'll just play for you now.
So here's what we did. We sampled about 350 reviewers worldwide. The vast majority with kit, like you got. Some got SI systems because they're a site like or something.
Right.
Thirds, 1/3 of each got Gigabyte, MSI, or ASUS, with the intent later to sample everybody with the other boards. The reviewers who started off with ASUS, just unfortunately, because of some things that we've still been working on with ASUS, have sometimes seen anomalous scores, lower scores, stability issues, even though the board itself is outstanding, and of course ASUS has an outstanding reputation. Reviewers doing Gigabyte and MSI have been taking right to water like fish and posting scores they expect to post, etc. So that's one
not
thing.
what I've heard from other reviewers. I've heard about some problems with the MSI boards from a couple people included.
Yeah.
There were definitely some early issues in the MSI BIOS first revision, the 113 BIOS. Hey, Steven, it's Robert Halleck, by the way.
Hey.
There were definite issues with the 113 BIOS that originally was provided by MSI and shipped with the reviewer kits. They've since published a 117 BIOS that has an enormous number of fixes for both reliability, memory overclocking support, and performance. And we've seen those reports in the field mostly clear up as a result of those BIOSes.
So you're saying anomalous performance is kind of what you're calling some of the stuff we're seeing. What numbers would you expect? I guess I don't mean like hard FPS, but what sort of if we pick an Intel chip out of the stack, where would you expect to align with Intel at 1080p?
I'll be very frank. We testing single-threaded IPC, we're 0 to 1% ahead of Broadwell E, and we're 6.8% back on KB Lake.
Is that a
now,
7700K or?
Yeah, 7700K. So that's single-threaded IPC at a fixed frequency. So I would expect in 1080p in games that our performance is equivalent or very near to Broadwell E. Now, what we can't do is make up for the clock speed advantage that KB Lake has.
Right.
So if you add 7% IPC plus 12% clock speed, assuming it all scales linearly, that should be the delta in the results.
Right.
So if we're seeing games that fall outside of that, we clearly have optimization work to do with developers, and we're doing it, but it's not something that can be done overnight.
And so as that clearly indicates, there were definite, as they said, definite issues with the 113 BIOS for the MSI board, and reviewers who worked with that board, and I do know a few of them, would have either had to retest or publish as is, depending on how close to launch it was, how they felt about it. When we encountered issues where it was pertinent to retest, we did so. And that's all noted in the article. Everything in there is the most up-to-date set of tests, the most up-to-date EFI, and the most up-to-date methodology that aligns with AMD where it makes sense to align with AMD without intentionally creating bottlenecks elsewhere. which we'll get to later. So the point is, EFI version matters. As you look through these reviews, as I said in the article, the differences in the reviews can be explained by EFI differences because the vendors, motherboard vendors, did not have enough time to finalize everything. It's very Spartan. They've all almost been, it's almost like an embarrassment when they tell us like, hey, EFI is not finalized yet. So it's when you show someone a work in progress thing and you want to make sure they understand like it's a work in progress. So that's kind of what it felt like. So that's part one. Part one's the EFI stuff and the motherboards. You will see differences in performance between boards. You will not see a difference significant enough that I'm aware of yet where the 1800X suddenly is on par in gaming performance with the 7700K. I have not yet found a difference from any of these revisions where that becomes the case. Best case, you're looking at a couple percent. Power saving mode. We tested with the correct mode. We tested with performance mode, which in testing provides somewhere around a 4% uplift maximum in the absolute best or worst case, depending on perspective, scenarios. So performance mode does increase performance. Again, not enough to push it into really better territory, but there is an uplift, and we did test with performance mode. So that was addressed again in the review, and is kind of important. The reason that's important is because with Windows and with this AMD processor, there's some issue where Windows is not fully developed for Ryzen. It's been built on Intel for years. So there's some kind of core parking or other issue there. It's resolved by going into performance mode, easily done, and we did that. There were, again, issues on memory support, so we can go through some of that. Now, memory support, again, if you read the article, I'm sorry to recap it for you, but on page 2 of the article, I talk about what is officially supported. We can put a screenshot on the screen to show you, but dual channel, dual rank, 1866, 2133, and up. AMD recommended testing be done, depending on whom you asked, at 2666, 2667 megahertz for the core testing to ensure there are no handshake communication issues between the IMC and the memory. Other folks recommended we clock as high as we could, and that was 2933 in our case. We did clock to 2933, and I don't know, it seems fine. So there's no real issues there. However, we were not able to clock higher than that. You could, and the steps to clock higher than 2933 would primarily be some manual tuning. So you can tune the reference clock, or effective BCLK. You can tune the reference clock and go through memory training and voltage. Doing that process, you'd basically boot at 2400, commit an EFI change, reboot, boot to 2666, EFI change, reboot, 3000 or 2933, I guess, reboot. And then after that point, you configure VDIM, probably to 1.4 volts, and you can configure the reference clock if necessary, but might be able to get up to 3200 at that point. It is not the easiest thing to do, and there are no sub-timings, as I said previously, in the BIOS, so that does complicate things with some memory kits. But basically, you're looking at 2933 is kind of the max we got. Other people may have gotten a bit higher. Some people tested 2666 per AMD's recommendation. Overall, a difference 2933 to 3200 is going to be largely irrelevant in gaming. I'm sorry, it won't get an extra 20 to 30% in game performance. But that should hopefully answer, again, the DRAM questions, which we've discussed on page 2 and in the review video. There's also an issue with ICs and memory. If you are using, and I've confirmed this with multiple sources, and it's very easy for you to confirm if you can get the kits, if you're using a Hynix die for the memory kit, which there was only one validated for use during this review, the Corsair Vengeance kit, which we used, 3000 megahertz kit. If you use a Hynix die, you're likely to have more trouble overclocking memory than with a better Samsung die. So that is something that, that hopefully should answer a few more questions about memory and why the Ryzen memory support seems to be like it's all over the place. And I think we can probably put memory to the side for now, and the EFI stuff. So that's most of the issues on the logistical side. There are a few more we'll discuss. That covers the testing differences with motherboards. EFI changes, again, will mean that the version of EFI plus the motherboard used by the outlet will produce different results than an outlet using a different motherboard or a different EFI, but they should not be so significant as to drastically change the hierarchical stack of where the 1800X lands, at least from what we've looked at thus far. That could change. I will further validate it, but that's where we are today. Now, of course, they also claimed again, as in the beginning of this video, that MSI was fine for all the reviewers working on them, when in fact that wasn't the case. In speaking to those other reviewers, when I pointed that out, and AMD agreed. So there's a bit of a communication and sampling limitation issue there. So as for other statements, concerns, things that people have pointed out this week, let's first start with the AMD comments pertaining to us on Reddit that they made, one of their community managers made. First of all, my quote, I believe from the article that has been shared in a few places, was I said, when we approached AMD with these results, the 1080p results pre-publication, the company defended its product by suggesting that intentionally creating a GPU bottleneck, read, no longer benchmarking the CPU's performance, that was my words, would serve as a great equalizer. AMD asked that we consider 4K benchmarks to more heavily load the GPU, thus reducing workload on the CPU and leveling the playing field. Before getting to the rest of this page, let's read some of the things they said in the Reddit AMA, just to show that this is messaging being relayed in a few places. A user asked, isn't it unfair to compare CPUs? If there's a GPU bottleneck, then all the CPUs will perform similarly. This is a point that I made in my review when I said the analog would be benchmarking GPUs with a low resolution like 720p or with low game settings. You could declare at a low setting that a GTX 1060 and an RX 480 are equivalent to a 1080 Ti, 1080, Vega, doesn't matter. If you're bottlenecked elsewhere in the system, you could declare, because the numbers would be the same, that the products are the same. That's how creating a bottleneck works and how it impacts results. So we fundamentally disagreed with the approach of doing 4K. However, AMD's response was, first, I think it's important that readers get a complete picture of a processor. People who have 1440p and 4K displays deserve to read their potential processor, how their potential processor will perform on the monitor they have. Don't you agree? Well, yes, we published 1440p results and there was still a difference. Ryzen, the 1800X, was still worse than a 7700K. The difference minimizes because you're introducing load on the GPU, as explained abundantly in the article and the video. But there's still a difference. Back to their comment though, they're saying we're also not shying away from the 1080p results. We clearly have some work to do with the game developers on some of these titles to invest in the vital optimizations that can so dramatically improve an application's performance on a new microarchitecture. This takes time, but it can be done. So again, this is something we talked about, but yes, there's clearly a software side limitation, but as I said in the review, it can take years to develop these games. It might be years until that performance difference is realized, and so we can't recommend today what might be good in a few years. It's just not, because I don't know. I don't know what it's going to be like in a few years. So then, what did AMD say about us on Reddit? They said, quote, regarding my quote, by the way, about the AMD asking us to bottleneck the GPU, which was my way of saying run at 1440p and 4K, knowingly creating a GPU side limitation where the differences would minimize. AMD said, I think this is a pretty unfair characterization of what we requested. We simply asked 1440p and 4K be tested alongside 1080p, to capture a complete performance profile of the product. 1440p and 4K customers deserve to know how new processors might be useful to them, right? That was our only request. Yes, using, it's nice to use, only request or simply asked. Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple, and it was not the only request. When we look through some of our conversations with AMD, which I will be happy to publish, we can see that I originally reached out before the review, a couple days before the review published, I reached out to an AMD team member and said, the 1800X is currently getting wrecked in game benchmarks. Are you guys seeing that? I gave some performance numbers. I said, I'm going to double check. Might be a resolution thing. Nope, resolution was fine. And so, of course, they say define getting wrecked. Yes, that wasn't the most explicit terminology, but I did give some frame rate numbers. And the reason that I reached out to them and said this is the same reason we reach out to SIs, other reviewers. It's so we can get a sanity check and say, are you guys seeing the same thing as us? Is this a methodological, equipment, or other difference? We need to know before we publish because we have to make sure the results are representative of the real world. So of course I reach out to AMD and say, are you seeing this? I want to make sure that I'm in line with what they would expect, and if not, we need to figure out why. So I email them. Unfortunately, AMD, when they posted that comment on Reddit, decided to post that without emailing us first to discuss it, but I suppose we've already had plenty of time to do that. So they said, more of a spread than I expected. What card? I said GTX 1080 FTW. And then they said, I know we have a delta, some games worse than others. In this segment, we expect people to have 1440p monitors at least, so that's where we focused. And in that case, we push the bottleneck to the graphics card sufficiently. Let me read that again. In that case, 1440p, we push the bottleneck to the graphics card sufficiently. So, I mean, they're acknowledging it, right? This isn't secret information. Everyone knows that more pixels, you're going to burden the graphics card. But as we say in the review, this really is a tough argument because you're looking at, okay, 1440p still performing a little bit worse, but it's not as bad. And maybe you have a production argument if for some reason you don't do the production tasks we tested on the GPU where it's 3 times faster. So, okay, maybe there's an argument. But when, as GPUs advance, because people buy a CPU on a platform and use it for several years, there's still a lot of people with 2600, 2500, 3570, and so forth. You buy a platform, you use it for a long time. GPUs iterate, people tend to replace their graphics card, at least our audience in general, tend to replace GPUs before CPUs. So you want to buy looking forward, which is interesting because that's AMD's argument. They're saying, well, buy looking forward. Eventually, they say, game developers will support our multi-threading. That may be the case. In fact, Bethesda and Stardock are working on it, and Oxide, as we speak, according to AMD. However, if we also take this argument of buying looking forward, you could look at the 1080p numbers and understand the actual processing differences and capabilities without imposing a bottleneck from an external resource. Seeing those numbers, we're able to see that as you upgrade GPUs looking forward, you might start running into issues where at 1440p, well, you will actually, at 1440p, that difference we're seeing moves from maybe 5% to something greater. And now you've bought a product that was $500 that underperforms to one that's $300 something. So I've addressed pretty much all sides of this. I understand what AMD's saying. I understand they're saying 1440p and 4K gamers are not going to notice the frame rate difference. Sure. But it doesn't mean the product's better, and that's what we said in the review. It's not better. That is objectively provable in frame rate and gaming performance scenarios. So ultimately it comes back to the review where we're saying if you have tasks where you can't GPU accelerate your production, maybe code compiles, maybe you compile kernels for Linux or browsers or whatever, maybe for some reason you do Blender and Premiere rendering on the CPU. I can't imagine why, because every case we do on a day-to-day basis, it's faster on a GPU significantly. I mean, you could put a 1070 in there and it would be a lot better, 2 times better. If you are in one of those cases, then yes, it is better than the 6900K, which we stated at the price definitively. There's some other caveats like limited memory support and things like that. But gaming, absolutely not. I stand by that statement. Do not buy the 1800X for gaming. It is not good for it. If gaming is all you do, you are limiting yourself. If gaming and production is what you do and it's on the CPU, maybe not so bad in that case. I mean, I'll point out in emailing AMD and asking about the SMT differences we saw, they confirmed that they saw differences sometimes up to 10% by disabling SMT. So we're not the only ones seeing that. AMD directly saw it, as did a few other websites. However, on Reddit, they said to someone asking about SMT, thanks for the question. In general, we've seen great performance from SMT in applications and benchmarks, but there are some games that are using code optimized for our competitor. We're confident that we can work through these issues with game developers who are actively engaging with our engineering teams. But they don't mention the 10% uplift that they mentioned to us. So the reason of putting this video out there have been a lot of questions about Ryzen, and the answer to why there have been so many questions is because the hype was so high and people had so seriously bought into this product. And it's really, AMD has done a fantastic job at catching up, but that's not the point. There's more to it than that. It has to be competitive. And for gaming, it's simply not. For production, absolutely. It is a competitive processor if you don't use GPU acceleration. Gaming, no. So yeah, they've put in a lot of work. We know they have. I spent a whole page talking about the architecture, but I hope this addresses some of the questions. If you haven't read it, read the article. It's 11,000 words. It talks about everything we could get to. And I mean, there's even stuff about thermals in there too. Like thermals are kind of problematic to measure, but I won't go over that again here. Thank you for watching, I suppose. If you have more questions, I probably won't answer them at this point unless they're genuinely unique, because this and the article and the other video should answer all of it. And my hour-long talk with Joker, which was live streamed on his channel. We're not the only site seeing these results. I would encourage you to check out other reviews, see what they have to say. If you see games where the thing is tied with a 7700K or 7600K, well, okay, it ties with a 7600K. If you see games and benchmarks where it ties with a 7700K, then the answer is probably that the resolution, the methodology, and the settings were different from ours. If you test at 4K, it's going to tie. And personally, I don't think that's a valid benchmark for CPU performance. I understand why you might be interested in the data, but it would not be what I base my purchases off of. If you do, or if the other sites do, that's great. We don't. If your reviews align with mine, then we've got a review for you. If they don't, there are plenty of other people out there who have reviews. I would encourage you to check theirs. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. Patreon.com/GamersNexus. If for some reason you made it this far, you probably already support us there. I'll see you all next time. I don't even know where to start with this, actually.